I want to go to Ruth. Since ancient times, did you guys know this? Jews have read the book of Ruth on Pentecost. One reason given is that Ruth's story is set in the spring, summer, the Pentecost harvest season. Another reason is that Ruth's acceptance into the Jewish faith is an analogy to Israel's acceptance of God's law, which occurred on a Pentecost centuries earlier. Many Christians view the book of Ruth as a remarkable illustration of God's plan of redemption for Israel and the church. In case you're not familiar with the story, here is the Cliff Notes version. During a time of famine in Israel, a Jewish family from Bethlehem, Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons immigrate to nearby Moab. Elimelech dies there, leaving Naomi a widow. The 2 sons marry, but after a while also pass on, leaving their wives widows as well. Naomi and her daughters-in-law are left penniless and alone. As the situation improves in Israel, Naomi decides to return home. One of her daughters-in-law chooses to stay in Moab with her familiar people and gods. You can read about that in Ruth 1:15. The other, Ruth, resolves to go to Israel with Naomi, where she will worship the God of the Jews. Naomi and Ruth return to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, at which time Ruth goes to work gleaning in the fields. As it turns out, the field Ruth is gleaning in belongs to a man named Boaz, who happens to be a close relative of Naomi. Appreciative of Ruth's loyalty to her mother-in-law, Boaz invites her to continue gleaning in his fields throughout the remainder of the harvest. To understand what happens next, we need to first be aware of 2 aspects of Jewish law. First, as prescribed in the Levitical statutes, when a person loses their land due to some misfortune, as would be the case with Naomi, a close relative can purchase or redeem that land back to the one who lost it. You can read that in Leviticus 25, verse 25. Second, according to Jewish custom related to the law of Levirate marriage, when a woman is widowed without having borne a son, as with the case with Ruth, a close relative is obliged to marry that widow to provide an heir to the deceased. You can read about that in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5-6. With these 2 statutes and Naomi and Ruth's respective situations in mind, we arrive at the key moment and climax of the story. Naomi is in need of a redeemer to repurchase her land, and Ruth is a widow who had no son to inherit the land. As a solution to both dilemmas, Naomi encourages Ruth to approach Boaz, who, as a close relative, qualifies to fulfill the role of redeemer. Without getting into the particulars of how this part of the saga plays out, the ultimate outcome is that Boaz, who has fallen in love with Ruth, happily agrees. He redeems Naomi's land and takes Ruth as his wife, thus becoming the family's kinsman redeemer. So what's the symbolism in this? Well, the most striking aspect of Ruth's story is how that the characters model the key players in God's plan of redemption. Naomi, as the Jew who loses her land and becomes destitute, represents Israel. Ruth, a Gentile bride who willingly accepts the God of Israel, represents the church. Boaz, as the kinsman redeemer from Bethlehem, represents the Messiah, who is our close blood relative and redeemer. The story itself here is a picture of God's plan enacted. In the process of redeeming Naomi and her land, Israel, Boaz, representative of the Messiah, takes a Gentile bride, the church, thereby saving both from a state of destitution. Many wonderful and detailed commentaries have been written about the book of Ruth and its prophetic implications. For the purposes of our Pentecost-centered study, however, I want to focus the reader's attention on the 3 underlying themes: a Gentile wedding, redemption, and the wheat harvest. To those who study eschatology, it goes without saying that these themes indicate the rapture of the church. The church is depicted as the bride throughout Scripture. A wedding is what occurs after the bridegroom comes for the bride. The themes of redemption and kinsman redeemer point to the Jubilee statutes in Leviticus 25, which also point to the bridegroom or Messiah's coming. Additionally, redemption is the word associated with the renewal of our physical bodies at the rapture. This brings us to the third underlying theme of Ruth, the wheat harvest. The ultimate question is, why has God chosen to redeem Ruth, a prophetic type of the church, against the backdrop of the Pentecost harvest season? Is this aspect of the true story merely incidental, a matter of random coincidence, or is it rather a prophetic clue as to the timing of the rapture?